Welcome to Morningstar Christian Chapel YouTube channel. Please remember to hit that subscribe button, like button, and the notification bell so you can find out when we go live or post a new video. And be sure to leave a comment about what God has shown you in this message. Thanks, and enjoy the study.
All right, let's open our Bibles this morning to the Gospel of Luke chapter 21, verse 1. As we continue this morning through the studies of the Gospel of Luke, we've come to the final week of Jesus' ministry before the cross. We often call it Passion Week, and we've been watching him how even at this time in his love for man, reached out to the people, to his foes with the gospel, just really to the end. Palm Sunday had presented Jesus the Messiah to the nation in fulfillment of prophecy. Daniel had prophesied in chapter 9, this was the exact day in which Jesus would come, the Messiah would come and present himself to the people. He wept over the city that day. He went down into the temple area, looked around. We're not really told biblically what happened the rest of that Sunday, but he went back up to the house of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha there in Bethany up on the top. They're actually just right over the top of the Mount of Olives. On Monday, he had cleared the temple for the second time, overturned tables, chased off the money changers, declared the house of worship had been made a house of thieves or a den of thieves. The fig tree that he had cursed on the way down on that Monday was dead by Tuesday morning. And again, the Lord returned from the home of Lazarus to the city to spend what would be his final day amongst the people before the cross, Tuesday. And he was there, and he was confronted almost all day, it does seem, by these various religious groups in opposition to him. They wanted to catch him in his words. Maybe he'll say something that will cause us to be able to have him arrested. Maybe he will alienate himself from some of his followers, which at this time were still many. Maybe they could even find cause to ask for his execution. But it wasn't the day of open arms reception of the Lord. And a few days from now would be the people who would exactly turn on him when they found out he wasn't going to be doing what they thought he should do. It was a day of confrontation, of opposition. For the last couple of weeks, or actually a few weeks, we've been in these events of Tuesday. It had all started when he cleansed the temple there on Monday, and the Scribes and Pharisees came to him the next day to ask him by what authority he had done that. That was followed up by some Herodians and Pharisees, not exactly groups that get along, but they came to ask Jesus publicly about paying taxes to Caesar. They thought, we could trap him with this, one way or another. He's not going to make somebody happy. And then the Sadducees came together asking about the resurrection, which they didn't believe in at all. Eventually, they kind of ran out of ammunition. And it was getting late in the day, and we looked in chapter 20 of Luke at the kind of the end of this long day. He was accosted one last time by a Pharisee that Matthew mentions, who came to tempt him, test him, ask him what the greatest commandment was. Jesus answered, and then he turned the tables on them. He said to the Pharisees and the scribes, let me ask you a question. And he began to speak to them from a theological standpoint. He appealed to their biblical knowledge. And he turned them there last week to the Psalms and asked them about David's quote there about, how can David call him Lord, but he's just his son and all. And he sought to bring them to a place where they recognized that Jesus was more than just the Son of David. He was the Son of God. And he laid it out for them very clearly and publicly. And yet we are told that they walked away silently. Mark records that the people heard him gladly, that it touched some hearts in the crowd. This was the last really public meeting that the Lord would have before Calvary. But most of the Pharisees walked away, and so the Lord turned to the crowd and to his disciples. Actually, he turned to the disciples, but the crowd spoke loud enough for them to hear, and he says, you be careful of living a life like these guys with wicked hearts, religious people that don't have any kind of relationship with the Lord at all. Be careful of being a scribe, having a Bible, but the Bible not having you, living a life of the flesh, but pretending you're living a life in the Spirit. And that really was it. They walked away, and so did Jesus. This morning, we're only going to look at the first 4 verses of chapter 21. It is the last event, really, in the city until the trials. Chapter 22, the rest of chapter 21 will take us about a mile across the Kidron Valley up the Mount of Olives, sitting on a rock somewhere with about 5 disciples who question one of Jesus' last comments as he leaves. And Tuesday, as the sun is setting, he will describe to them what comes next for Israel and for the nation. But this little 4-verse section, I'm glad it's here because it seems to me that unlike the scribes and the Pharisees, the last thing we see Jesus mentioning in the temple before sitting down and talking about the future of the land was this beautiful little widow lady that just blessed his heart. I don't doubt that the Lord is overwhelmed with weariness by the day. You know, he was all man. He was God, certainly, but he experienced all that we do. I'm sure he was discouraged at how close to the cross he was, and yet how little fruit had come from his ministry in terms of what you could see. Jesus sits down in the court of the women. The court of the women was just outside the court of the Gentiles. It was a large area in the temple. It could probably easily hold 15 or 20,000 people. It was a big, empty courthouse, but it was there in the middle of the court of the women that the treasury was placed. Having seen the hypocrisy of these leaders and voiced it publicly and openly, now the Holy Spirit gives us a picture of complete contrast. A very non-influential, subdued little woman who just brings a joy to the Lord's heart. And I think if you read these 4 verses, you will change your mind about how you handle money or how the church should talk about it. Jesus had said in the Sermon on the Mount, wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. So, with that being said, and in light of this verse, we find that really money does talk. It tells a lot about where your heart resides. What does the way you handle what you have say about you? Because wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. Jesus tells us here that much of a man's devotion to the Lord can be revealed in the way he gives. Something that would otherwise be hidden is made manifest, is made known by the way we give. A wise one, I forget who the guy was. I'm going to call him a wise man, but I don't remember his name. If I can remember it, I'll just throw it out there later. He said that the last bit of our flesh to be redeemed was the hand that holds onto our wallets. And he said, if the Lord can get a hold of that, he's truly got you. But I love this passage because this, along with obviously many other passages, I think gives us a profoundly different view of giving and receiving and need than you will learn from the false TV evangelist or the fellow who leaves the impression in the world that Christians are just after your money. These are Jesus' departing words. They are simple, they are profound, and it's the last thing that he says before he leaves the temple behind. We read in verse 1, as he looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. The treasury, like I said, was in the court of the women. We are told historically that it consisted of 13 kind of brass trumpets. They were very large, with the big side down and the narrow side up, and there was an opening at the top that had kind of been worn shiny, I think, by all the hands that had pressed over it. The Hebrew word is shepheroth, but they were there to receive the offerings of the people who passed by. According to the Mishnah, each one of these tubes, if you will, trumpets, whatever the shepheroth, were marked for a different purpose. There was one sign on one that said newt shekels. There was another one that said old shekels due. There was one for the burnt offerings, another for the wood for the mercy seat. And there were 6 of them marked just free will offerings. Due to the Passover and the million or so people in town, this place would have been packed. Mark tells us in chapter 12 that Jesus sat down across from the treasury to see, here's the word, how the people placed their money into the treasury, and then it says, many who were rich put in much. We read here in verse 1 as well. He looked up and he saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. Jesus, as the peeper watcher, watching folks that didn't know they were being observed. And I always like the picture because I don't know if you ever sat at an airport or in a crowded mall or somewhere and you just watch people go by. We are a weird bunch. And I've noticed there aren't very many good-looking people, which is good for the rest of us. Imagine you being in this crowd this day and the Lord on the bench watching your every move and knowing your every thought. We read that this morning. God just knows all about us. And the people weren't aware of it. Maybe we live most of our lives like we're not aware of it either, but maybe we should be. It's a staggering truth. If you live with that awareness that the Lord was watching or the Lord was with you, it can change the way you live. When Hannah was so brokenhearted about not being able to have a child year after year, she, there in 1 Samuel 2, was praying to the Lord for her situation. And she said to herself, you should talk no more proudly, and let not arrogance come out of your mouth. For the Lord is the Lord of knowledge, and he weighs every action. He knows everything about you. And she just reminded herself that the Lord was there. David, we read it this morning. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thoughts afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. You're acquainted with all of my ways. God is aware. Even now, God is watching you. He sees you beyond the outward form to the motive, to the thought, to the feelings, to the attitudes that we hide within. No one else might see them, but he does. And so when you read in Mark chapter 12, verse 41, the Lord sat down to see how the people were giving and that the rich were giving much. It's an interesting, it goes to that idea of the Lord sitting and watching. He wanted to know how, not what, and not how much, just how. In fact, he said, he sat down to look at how, and the rich gave much. Not that God would be displeased with much giving necessarily, but here, as in Mark, the focus is not on the amount, it's on the attitude. It's in the attitude of the heart. It is a public place. And unfortunately, this public place where thousands of people gathered gave an opportunity to everyone to draw attention to themselves, to get glory for themselves, especially if you had a lot to give. There'd be a lot of people there to applaud. I remember one time, and I'll never forget, watching I think it was a Jerry Lewis telethon. They used to do those quite often. But there was a guy that stood up and said he wanted to give $500 anonymously. Well, wait a minute. You're on the TV, and there your face is. But I thought, what would happen to our national charities without public, subscriber list or bronze plaques or pictures and online of donors or 3-foot-long checks and picture of them holding it and here's what I'm giving, Even churches, some of them, if you've been into a couple, have walks of faith with the names of people written in stone on the walkways, contributors on the back of the chairs or the pews. In fact, if you'd like a pew of your own, so stupid. You go to the hospital, there's a whole wall of people that have funded this place. Go to a college building, the rich guy gets his name on it. It never stops. There's something to be said for getting glory for what I've done. And this was no different. This was no different at all. Here at the temple, the rich would come with bags of coins, but they were too heavy to carry themselves, so servants would bring them, and they would slowly parade themselves through the treasury, and then just slowly pour out the coins, like a Las Vegas slot machine in the old days. And everyone would stop, and I'm still hearing it. It's still going. And the giver could have that proud, top that look. Unfortunately, the ability to do a good deed on a scale impossible for others, creating for him a delusion of superiority. We find it often among the rich. This kind of display Jesus had warned about. He said to the disciples in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, verse 1, "Take heed that when you do your charitable deeds before men, you aren't doing them to be seen of them, otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, don't sound the trumpet as the hypocrites do in the synagogues or in the streets, that they may have the glory of men. I say to you, they have their reward. When you do a charitable deed, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Then you can do it in secret, and your Father who sees in secret can reward you openly." External religion worn on the sleeve has already received its reward. So we read here, Jesus watched how they gave, how that some came with the fanfare, that some came with the self-glory, but into the noise and the din and the crowds, an approaching widow was about to bring Jesus to his feet with joy. And after all that he had gone through, all of the charades and the dealing with these false religious groups, and they're laying in wait, and it's so close to the cross, and he's come to save, here comes a woman who had a deep love for the Lord. And it showed. And it blessed him. How do you give? Outward show. The Bible has a lot to say about giving. Freely you have received, freely give. Romans chapter 12, it says, give with simplicity. 1 Corinthians 6:16, give regularly. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, give with cheerfulness. And if you can't do those things, I would suggest to you, don't give at all. Just keep whatever it is you can't let go of. Because the Lord is always looking about how you give, not how much. After all, he's the Lord. He doesn't really care about how much. He has it all anyway. It all belongs to him. And even if you have it, he can take it from you in a minute. So it isn't about how much. It's about how. And if you can't line up with what God is pleased with, stop. You're just fooling yourself. So Jesus sits down, watches the rich putting in their gifts. Verse 2, and he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. Our hero approaches into Jesus' field of vision. She's dressed in the poverty or in the clothing of widowhood. One of the most difficult positions, by the way, culturally, first century, to occupy. You couldn't work as a woman, and if the family didn't take care of you, you were pretty much left to beg. In her hands were 2 little coins. The word mite is the word lepta. The word lepta means to peel. It describes how thin these coins were. In fact, the lepta is the thinnest coin that was used. It was the smallest coin that was made. It was worth about 1/64 of a denarius, or about 1/8 of a cent. So she had in her hands 1/4 of a cent. But these were her earnings. This is what she had. This is what she had to live, from hand to mouth, from food or for sustenance. And she undoubtedly approached the treasury chests much quieter than the rich. In fact, I suspect she hoped no one would notice her. Almost felt out of place, insignificant. Her only concern was that the Lord would see that he was watching. What she didn't do, he was sitting right over there. As an aside, and it really doesn't come up in the story here, I should just mention to you, she is putting her money into a place that would be taken by crooked people and spent in crooked ways. And somehow that didn't seem to be her concern. That God would have to deal with. She was going to serve the Lord, and the Lord was going to take care of her. The law called for it, and she wanted to serve the Lord. So she comes with little to give. Interesting, the Lord mentions how much, so he could teach us about the how. No noise as she walked up. I'm sure that those two little thin coins didn't make much of a noise landing on top of all the shekels that were down at the bottom of this tube. The fact that she had 2 coins afforded her the opportunity to keep one of them. Who could fault her for that? Half of her wealth, half of her sustenance, she's going to give to the Lord. But no, all she had, she gave in love to the Lord. There weren't any oohs from the crowd. No one stopped to look around except Jesus. And all of heaven rejoiced. We are told in Mark chapter 12, verse 43, that the Lord, in seeing this, called his disciples over. Literally says, come here, I want you to see this. Before speaking to them what we have here in verse 3 and 4. He called them over, come and see. And he said to them, verse 3, truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all of her livelihood that she had. The words more than all, the way that is written in the Greek would say more than everyone that had put in up to this point, more than them all. Now, if you're keeping a financial statement, that wouldn't be true. But this is God speaking to you about what he sees. The Lord had watched them all come and go. His reasoning is straightforward, but it's very revealing. The rich had given out of their abundance, their overflow, their extra. It required no sacrifice. She had given out of her poverty. The word is lack or need, or the fact she couldn't afford to do this. And we might have advised her against it. She put in her whole livelihood. She had to choose between food for the body or satisfaction for the soul. She had to choose between sustenance and worship. And that's the choice that she made. She chose the latter. And Jesus watched and rejoiced and called his boys and said, look at this. Look at this. After a whole day of bark, 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 he got this. 3 days from now, he would give his life for the sins of the world. But I'm sure that it is this kind of fruit and that drove him on. Two points that we should learn just from these few verses. Number one, God is most interested in how you give, and attached to that is the cost to you. That God, in terms of the way he looks at your giving, judges in terms of proportion and not portion. It's not the amount, but what the amount costs you. You should give in a way that costs you something. If you take someone to dinner on the company credit card, that's not exactly you. David, when he numbered the people and the people began to die as God's judgment, and he cried out for help, and the Lord told him to purchase a field and to build an altar so that the punishment would stop. He went in 2 Samuel chapter 24 to Araunah, who owned this land, and Araunah, seeing the disaster that the judgment of God was bringing, said, just take it. Please hurry. People are dying. And David said this to him, I will certainly buy it from you at a full price. I cannot offer burnt offerings to the Lord on that which costs me nothing. And then it says he paid full price. Why? Because it's consistent with what God's heart is in the way we're stewards. In your giving, it should cost you something. She gave all that she had. C.S. Lewis wrote, I can't believe one can settle how much we ought to give except to follow the safe rule that we should give more than we can spare before it's accessible. For the rich, a great gift could be way too little. For the poor, the smallest gift will never go unnoticed in heaven. God is interested in the love that sacrifices. Now, in the amount, he'll never be moved by the amount. Here's what Paul wrote to the Corinthians, second letter. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace that God has bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and out of their absolute deep poverty, it abounded in the riches of their liberality. I bear you witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond, they were willing to implore us with much urgency that we should receive a gift and the fellowship of the ministering of the saints, and not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then they gave themselves to us by the will of God. Paul was blown away. So the widow here reveals her heart to the Lord. She gave all that she had, and Jesus was honored with her giving, even though the men who ruled there were corrupt and selfish. It is our commitment here at Morningstar that we believe Jesus provides, and that we really can't give until we love the Lord. And so our focus is to teach you about Jesus. And then if that works, and if that's biblically correct, then God will provide all that we need. So we just teach the Bible here. I don't ever talk about money or needs, ever, unless we run into it in the scriptures. God pays the bills. God moves the heart. God provides. And the Old Testament, I think, will bear that out. When you read in the book of Exodus, when the Lord begins to give directions for the building of the temple or the tabernacle they're going to be carrying through the wilderness. In chapter 36, there's an order that Moses gave to the children of Israel that every morning they should bring a freewill offering, and then he assigned these builders and masons and artisans to begin to build, and the craftsmen to begin to do the work. And at some point, according to Exodus 36, they came back to Moses and they said, tell the people to quit giving. We have more than we need. Now you tell me how often you hear that on a TV message. But that's when the Lord works. That's when the Lord is faithful. A chapter earlier, in chapter 35, in giving directions, the Lord said, tell the children of Israel to bring an offering to me for the temple. Everyone that brings it willingly from their heart, you can take it. In other words, I don't need it, but if their hearts are into it, God can use them. So we take offerings on Sunday mornings. We trust the Lord will provide. I should tell you this morning, the church is debt-free. We don't owe anybody anything. God has paid for everything that we have. We employed 20 plus people here. We support several missionaries and outreaches. The radio is not cheap. The outreaches are expensive in that regard, but God has provided. And I don't think you'll ever hear from me going, we need some money. If God's not providing, we're just not going there. It isn't build it and then they'll come. We just wait until the Lord provides. We're not spending by faith. We're waiting on him by faith. When Joash, the king, was sent to bring reforms to the land in I think it's Chronicles 21, and that he wanted to refurbish the tabernacle, you'll read there that the people came to give with joy, and the place was restored. When Ezra was led back brought a contingency to build the temple in Jerusalem after the captivity, the people gave according to their ability, and Ezra said that they had more than they needed. On the other hand, when folks are out of fellowship with God, giving usually stops, or it becomes that look at me again thing, and God doesn't honor it. If you read Haggai chapter 1, when the temple was supposed to be rebuilt, the people did it for a little while and they got tired of it and they just said, well, let's forget it. We're just going to build the Lord's house later. I got to build my own house first. And then you read the Lord saying this to them through the prophet. The time has not come to build the Lord's house. Is that what you said? Then the Lord came through Haggai the prophet. He said, is it time for you to dwell in your paneled homes, and this temple lies in ruins? Therefore, thus saith the Lord, consider your ways. You've sown much, brought in little. You eat, never enough. You drink, you're not filled with drink. You clothe yourself, you're not warm. You earn wages to put it in pockets with holes. And the Lord says, consider your ways. God didn't accept it. It wasn't pleasing to him. Our policy regarding giving and receiving is, I just want you to know the Lord. And if that doesn't make you a giver, nothing will. Because you can be cheerful only when you realize he provides for all that you have. So how do you give? I think the question becomes, how do you give? Well, it's tax time. If you are on the downside of that and you have to pay taxes this year, I should just tell you, the IRS could care less what kind of attitude you have as you write that check. As long as it arrives on time, they're happy. But God is interested in you giving out of love. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3, it says, though I bestow all of my goods to feed the poor, though I give my body to be burned, if I have not love, it profits me nothing. Why? Because God doesn't need it. He doesn't need your help, doesn't need mine. It's joyful without resentment. It has to be given with joy. It has to be given in a way that it costs me something. Every gift should cost us something. I remember buying things for my wife when I was young that I couldn't afford because I loved her. How much did this cost? You idiot. Yeah, that's pretty much what I heard. But hey, love will drive you to give with joy. God can do great things with small offerings. Just think how much has been accomplished by these two mites over the last 2,000 years. The rich guys have come and gone, but she continues to bear fruit. And God is an equal opportunity God. Not having much does not lower your ability to serve him, because it's proportional, not portional. It all comes down to how you give and how it costs you something. Ken Hughes, one of my favorite guys, he's actually just retired, but he's a great Bible writer, commentator. But he wrote this, and it was kind of amusing, but I think tongue-in-cheek. He wrote this. There's a disease that is spreading the country. It is especially infectious in this part of the 21st century. It is called cirrhosis of the giver. He said it was first discovered by a couple who died named Ananias and Sapphira. It is an acute condition that renders the patient's hands immobile when it tries to pass money from pocket to plate. Unfortunately, the remedy is simple and instant. Just remove the individual from the house of the Lord, for clinical studies have proven and shown those symptoms do not repeat themselves in alternative environments like shopping malls, amusement parks, or theaters. And then he wrote this: actually, the disease is not a motor problem at all. It's an issue of the heart. The best remedy is to fall in love with Jesus, and then you'll want to give him all that you have with joy. After all, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. Father, thank you this morning for your word to us. How good it is to know that you have a different attitude towards all that we've been given than certainly we are told by the world or by the hustler or by the latest trickster as he seeks to make himself rich at the expense of your love or lack thereof of the Lord. Thank you, Father, that you don't need any of us, that giving is not your way of raising funds, but it's your way of raising children, that you want us to depend upon you, that we're thankful for all that you have provided, that Lord, there are many folks here who, in loving you, give to you constantly, faithfully, and with great joy. Thank you that you don't need, but you'd like to involve us in the process, so we might be blessed as we stand and watch what you do. And Lord, for those that have maybe watched online tonight or this morning and been stumbled for years by those who present themselves as God's servants, who are indeed after just whatever's in their pockets, whatever's in their hands, appeal letters, guilt trips, needy pleas for help. Thank you, Father, that our God is able to provide all that we need. And we can set our church forward as an example that you are a faithful God who provides for all that we need. Bless you, Lord. And may those that are this morning just having to live week to week and check to check, and just may you provide all that they need, and may they rely upon you and put you first in all that they do. Shall we stand?